Okay, so the first we're going to talk about is atrophy. Atrophy um, is when the cell and therefore the organ. So a lot of times you hear about organ atrophy, where the organ becomes smaller, but it's where it's that's the key word is that it becomes smaller. Um, Now, why would a cell or why would an organ atrophy? A lot of times, why would mean that there was some kind of damage that occurred. But the advantages of cells getting smaller goes back to this efficiency or this laziness. They decrease oxygen consumption if they're not being used um, for whatever reason. Then they don't want to use as much oxygen. You can shunt that oxygen away from that particular organ, and you can use that oxygen somewhere else. Okay, that needs the oxygen. Okay, fewer and smaller organelles to support. So if a cell with its endoplasmic reticulum and its Golgi apparatus and all that other stuff, well, if it's not really using that stuff, well, that stuff can become pretty small, and then you don't have to use the resources for that. Mitochondria, all those things. So you can reduce the number of mitochondria. That's actually something that happens with when you don't run. If you are an exerciser, you increase the number of mitochondria. If you just kind of sit around on the couch, hopefully studying, then you will decrease the number of mitochondria in your muscle cells. Okay, so fewer proteins are made overall. That's in general. Fewer proteins are made, which also decreases energy and resource use and demand. You don't need as many amino acids. You don't need as much glucose. You don't need as many nutrients to take care of those cells. So hopefully that makes sense, and that's the term atrophy or the shrinkage or getting smaller. So there are a couple of types of atrophy. There's disuse and there's denervation. Hopefully these just kind of make sense. Disuse means you're not using it. Okay, so this is very common in muscle cells. That's usually where you hear about it. If you have this example here works just fine, an arm encased in a cast, well, that arm will shrink or that muscle will shrink. Okay, that doesn't necessarily mean that those cells are dying off. Maybe if it goes on long enough, those cells will die. But in general, we're talking about them just getting smaller at first. A patient on a ventilator, so that's the diaphragm, and so when you take that person off the ventilator, they may have some difficulty because of atrophy in the diaphragm muscle. Isn't able to support their respiration. Prolonged immobility. Okay, so prolonged immobility, whether that's forced on you because you're sick or whether it's just because you have chosen not to be mobile. Okay, denervation is a little different, but it is still a form of disuse atrophy, except in this case, your neurons have become detached. So these are muscle cells over here, and if the nerve cells have become detached, or there's been damage to the nerve cell, this happens a lot of times with spinal cord injuries and those kinds of things, then the muscle is not getting the feedback from that neuron. So there's constant feedback from neurons that and whatever they're innervating that says, okay, yeah, I still got you, yeah, I'm still here. When that signal goes away, then that's a cell that's no longer going to be used. So it will atrophy. It will get smaller. It may over time eventually die and actually be replaced by fibrous tissue. Okay, so this can be partial or it can be complete. This picture shows partial denervation, so it shows that this neuron is no longer functional. But in this case, this one would probably rewire and maybe take on those that weren't initially working. But still, in the meantime, it will shrink. And then if you lose all use, then all of that entire muscle will atrophy. Okay, so also hormonal. Hormones affect tissue, organ, and size. We know that because of hypertrophy, which is the next thing we're going to talk about. That's why people take steroids, testosterone, because that is a signal that tells the muscle cell, in this case, to grow. Okay, so hormones, that's one of the things that hormones do, is they go straight to the nucleus and they start to turn on genes. Okay, and those genes, since genes code for proteins, they produce more proteins, whether it's muscle, fibers, or anything, whatever it is that particular cell responds to when presented with that particular hormone. Okay, so examples: breast and sex organ atrophy with prolonged decrease in estrogen, such as is associated with menopause. And of course, again, over time, these atrophied cells may in fact just simply go away. They may go for such a prolonged period without any kind of a growth signal that they just go through apoptosis and die. Testosterone abuse may lead to testicular atrophy, so the testicles will shrink because that's their job. There are cells in there that say to make testosterone, but if there's negative feedback and there's plenty of testosterone, then those are not being used, and so they'll again preserve their energy and they will atrophy. Okay, so restriction of nutrients also leads to atrophy. Uh, and that makes sense because that means you are able to survive with fewer resources. So directly is inadequate nutrition. Now that's something that is seen in like POW, prisoner of war, people who are imprisoned without food or left without food. Their muscles atrophy and they become very weak, and it's because those muscles, even though they've got proper innervation, the person may even be trying to use them, they simply don't have the nutrients, they don't have the resources to, or the amino acids to build the proteins, and so the proteins are not built. Ischemia. Well, ischemia is just when you're not getting proper blood flow to a particular tissue or a region of tissue, and so it kind of does the same thing. If you don't have blood flow, well, you're not getting the nutrients, you're not getting all of the things you need. So that cell will adapt and it will say, okay, this is our life now. We are living now without enough oxygen. We're living without enough nutrients, without enough glucose, without enough amino acids, all of those things. And so it will trigger apoptosis in that case too. And so that would be a prolonged period. Okay, so not to the point where it's causing necrosis.